At the start of the 20th century, two powerful nations had their eyes on the same prize. These nations were the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan. Both wanted to control more land and resources in East Asia, particularly in a region called Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula. Russia, a huge country stretching across Europe and Asia, was looking for a warm water port for its navy. Its port at Vladivostok would freeze over in the winter, which was a big problem. This made the ice-free Port Arthur, located on the Liaodong Peninsula in China, look very attractive to the Tsar. Russia saw expanding its influence in this part of the world as its destiny and a way to secure its eastern borders for good. Japan, on the other hand, was an island nation that had recently modernized its military and industry at an incredible speed. After centuries of isolation, it had transformed itself into a major power. Japanese leaders believed that to protect their country and secure the resources needed for their growing industries, they had to build an empire of their own. They looked towards Korea and nearby parts of China as essential for their national security and economic future. The Japanese saw Russia's growing presence in the region as a direct threat to their own plans. They felt that if Russia took control of Korea, Japan itself would be in danger. This clash of ambitions set the stage for a major conflict. The tension between the two empires grew worse and worse. Both countries tried to negotiate, but neither was willing to give up its main goals. Russia thought Japan was a much weaker nation and did not take its military threats very seriously. The Russians believed their large army and navy would easily defeat the Japanese if a war started. Japan, however, had been carefully preparing for this exact fight. It had formed an important alliance with Great Britain in 1902, which meant Russia would have to think twice about getting help from its own allies, like France. The stage was set, and the world watched as these two giants headed towards an unavoidable and bloody confrontation over their competing dreams of empire. Diplomatic talks finally broke down in early 1904. Japan felt it had no other choice but to act decisively before Russia could move more of its massive army into the region using its new Trans-Siberian Railway. The Japanese government decided that a surprise attack was the best way to gain an early advantage in the coming war. They believed that a quick, powerful strike could cripple the Russian navy, stationed in the Far East, and give Japan control of the seas. This control was absolutely vital for moving Japanese troops and supplies to the mainland. On the night of 8th February 1904, without any formal declaration of war, Japanese torpedo boats quietly sailed towards the Russian naval base at Port Arthur. The war began with a shocking and audacious move by the Japanese Imperial Navy. Under the cover of darkness, a squadron of Japanese destroyers launched a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur. While the attack did not sink as many ships as the Japanese had hoped, it caused significant damage and created chaos among the Russian command. Two of Russia's best battleships were badly damaged, and the confident Russian Navy was suddenly put on the defensive. This bold first strike demonstrated Japan's military readiness and its willingness to take huge risks. It also trapped the Russian Pacific Fleet inside the harbor, giving Japan the naval superiority it desperately needed to begin its land invasion of Korea and Manchuria. With the Russian Navy bottled up, Japan could safely transport its armies across the sea. Japanese soldiers quickly landed in Korea and then moved into Manchuria, pushing the Russian forces back. The main goal on land was to capture the heavily fortified naval base of Port Arthur. The siege of Port Arthur became one of the longest and most brutal battles of the war. Russian soldiers defended the fortress with trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns. The Japanese army, led by General Nogi Marisuke, launched repeated massive frontal assaults against the Russian positions. These attacks resulted in horrific casualties for the Japanese, with thousands of soldiers dying in wave after wave of attacks against heavily defended hills. The fighting on the ground was incredibly difficult for the soldiers on both sides. They faced harsh weather conditions, from freezing winters to hot, dusty summers. Disease spread quickly through the camps, killing almost as many men as the fighting did. The battles were defined by new and deadly technologies. Machine guns could cut down hundreds of attacking soldiers in minutes, and powerful artillery shells could destroy trenches and fortifications. For the soldiers in the thick of it, the war was a terrifying experience of constant shelling, surprise attacks, and the grim reality of trench warfare, which would later become infamous in the First World War. The human cost of these battles was immense and shocking to the world. After months of bloody fighting and staggering losses, the Japanese finally captured the critical high ground overlooking Port Arthur in late 1904. From this position, they could use their heavy siege guns to fire directly down into the harbor, sinking the remaining ships of the Russian Pacific Fleet one by one. With his fleet destroyed and no hope of relief, the Russian commander surrendered the fortress in January 1905. The fall of Port Arthur was a huge victory for Japan and a devastating blow to Russia's morale and war effort. It freed up the experienced Japanese siege army to join the main fight further north in Manchuria, setting the stage for even larger battles to come. While the Japanese army was winning on land, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, made a desperate decision to turn the tide of the war. He ordered Russia's Baltic fleet to sail halfway around the world to the Far East. This was an incredible undertaking. The fleet, renamed the Second Pacific Squadron, had to travel over 18,000 nautical miles, a journey that would take more than 7 months. Led by Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, the fleet of old and new ships faced enormous challenges. They struggled to get coal for fuel, as many ports were closed to them due to Britain's alliance with Japan. The long, difficult voyage tired out the crews and wore down the ships, leaving them in poor condition for the battle that awaited them. The Japanese admiral, Togo Heihachiro, knew the Russian fleet was coming. He had spent months training his crews and preparing his ships for this single, decisive encounter. He correctly guessed that the Russian fleet would try to take the shortest route to the Russian port of Vladivostok, which was through the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan. Admiral Togo positioned his modern, faster fleet to intercept the Russians. He had a clear plan and a well-drilled navy that was confident after its earlier successes. The Japanese sailors were highly motivated, knowing that the fate of their nation rested on the outcome of this one battle. They were ready and waiting for the exhausted Russian fleet to arrive. On 27 May 1905, the two fleets finally met in the Tsushima Strait. Admiral Togo executed a brilliant and risky maneuver. As the Russian fleet approached in a long, clumsy line, he ordered his ships to turn across the front of the Russian column, a move known as crossing the T. This allowed the Japanese ships to fire all their main guns at the leading Russian vessels, while the Russians could only fire back with their forward-facing guns. The Japanese gunnery was also far more accurate and rapid. Within hours, the Russian fleet was thrown into chaos. Japanese shells filled with a powerful explosive tore through the Russian ships, starting fires and causing massive damage. The Battle of Tsushima was a complete and overwhelming victory for Japan. It was one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Almost the entire Russian fleet was sunk or captured. Out of 38 Russian ships, only a handful managed to escape to safety. Thousands of Russian sailors were killed or taken prisoner, while the Japanese lost only 3 torpedo boats. The destruction of the Baltic fleet was a national humiliation for Russia and the final blow to its war effort. When news of the disaster reached St. Petersburg, it shattered any remaining hope of a Russian victory and forced the Tsar to face the reality that the war was lost. With its army defeated in Manchuria and its navy destroyed at Tsushima, Russia could no longer continue the war. The country was also facing growing unrest and revolution at home, partly caused by the anger over the humiliating defeats. Both Japan and Russia were exhausted by the conflict, and their economies were stretched to the breaking point. The Japanese, despite their victories, were running out of money and manpower. Seeing an opportunity to act as a global peacemaker, the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, offered to mediate peace talks between the two warring nations. Both sides accepted his offer, and delegations traveled to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the summer of 1905. The negotiations were difficult. Japan, as the clear winner on the battlefield, came with high demands. They wanted control over Korea, the evacuation of Russian troops from Manchuria, and the transfer of Port Arthur and the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Most controversially, they demanded a large payment, known as an indemnity, from Russia to cover the costs of the war. The Russian negotiators refused to pay any indemnity, seeing it as a national disgrace. For a moment, it seemed the talks would fail. However, President Roosevelt worked hard behind the scenes, persuading the Japanese to drop their demand for money in exchange for securing their other territorial gains. The Treaty of Portsmouth was signed on 5 September 1905, officially ending the Russo-Japanese War. The treaty confirmed Japan's victory. Russia agreed to recognize Japan's paramount interests in Korea, transferred its lease on Port Arthur and the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan, and ceded the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Both countries agreed to pull their troops out of Manchuria. Although the Japanese public was unhappy that Russia did not have to pay an indemnity, the treaty was a massive strategic success for Japan. For his role in ending the war, Theodore Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906, highlighting America's growing influence on the world stage. The Russo-Japanese War had a profound impact on world history. It was the first time in the modern era that an Asian power had defeated a major European power. This victory shattered the myth of European racial superiority and inspired nationalist movements across Asia and Africa. For Japan, the war established it as a new world power and fueled its imperial ambitions, which would lead to further conflict in the decades to come. For Russia, the humiliating defeat was a major cause of the 1905 revolution and exposed the deep weaknesses of the Tsarist government, ultimately paving the way for its collapse in 1917. The war was a true turning point, signaling a shift in the global balance of power and setting the stage for the conflicts of the 20th century.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.